There is a house in the Russian forest that will not simply stand there and be found. It has to be asked. You come upon it in a clearing, at the end of a path that shouldn't have led anywhere. It is small and old and built of dark logs. And it is standing, this is the detail that matters, on two great scaled and taloned legs, like a bird's. It has no door on the side that faces you. To get in, you have to speak to it, the way you'd speak to a person. Hut, hut, turn your back to the forest and your front to me. And if you've said it right, the hut turns, slowly, on its bird legs, grinding around in the needle litter, until the door is where your voice was. Around the hut there is a fence, and the fence is made of bones. Human bones, topped with skulls. And after dark, the skull's eye sockets are said to glow, like lanterns somebody forgot to put out. In some tellings, one post on the fence is bare, waiting. The woman who lives inside is called Baba Yaga. She is often blind, or nearly so, and she finds you by smell, sniffing the air and announcing, in the old formula, that it smells of the Russian spirit, meaning you. She is bone-legged, iron-toothed, and in the tales that bother to describe her at all, somehow too large for her own house. Stretched across the stove with her legs in one corner, and her head in another, and her nose grown into the ceiling. And she does not walk. When Baba Yaga travels, she sits inside a mortar, the kind you'd grind grain in, and rows herself through the air with the pestle, sweeping her tracks away behind her with a birch broom as she goes. It is worth sitting with that image for a moment, because it is stranger than it first sounds. She isn't riding some purpose-built implement of witchcraft. She is flying in her own kitchen equipment, the mortar, the pestle, the broom. These were ordinary objects in an ordinary Russian household. The horror, such as it is, comes from the completely mundane. Here is the question the character raises the moment you actually look at her. Is she the danger, or is she the door? Because in the tales, she is never only one or the other. She eats children who wander into her reach. There is an oven in her hut, and it is not decorative. But she is just as often the figure a hero has to reach on purpose, deliberately, because she is the only one who has what he needs. A horse that can outrun the world, a ball of thread that rolls ahead of you and shows the road, water that kills and water that brings back to life. She is dangerous exactly the way weather is dangerous, not out of malice, but because you have entered her country, and her country runs on its own rules. And the rules are almost never about goodness, or courage, or cleverness. They are about conduct. What Baba Yaga rewards, again and again, is a visitor who behaves correctly in her house, who greets her properly, who does the work she sets without complaint, who does not ask the one question that shouldn't be asked. Get the manners right, and the most feared figure in the forest will hand you exactly what you came for. Get them wrong, and the oven is right there. The clearest version of this, and the one worth telling in full, because it contains almost everything Baba Yaga is the story of a merchant's daughter named Vasilisa. It comes to us from Alexander Afanasyev, a Russian civil servant and folklorist who spent the 1850s and 60s collecting tales from across the Russian and Ukrainian countryside and publishing them, 8 volumes of them eventually, under the title Narodnie Ruski Skazki, Russian Folk Tales. Vasilisa the Beautiful is one of the best-known stories in that collection, and it begins the way a great many of these stories begin, with a dying mother. Before she dies, Vasilisa's mother gives her daughter two things: a small doll and a blessing. "Feed the doll," she says, "and it will help you through anything." Then she dies, and the father remarries, and the new stepmother arrives with two daughters of her own, and the three of them set about making Vasilisa's life as hard as they can. She is worked like a servant in her own home, and every night, when the house is asleep, she feeds the doll a scrap of bread and tells it her troubles, and every morning her impossible chores are somehow already done. The family eventually moves to a house near the edge of the forest. Near, though nobody says this directly, the forest where Baba Yaga lives. And on an autumn night, the stepmother contrives to put out every fire in the house. All of them, down to the last candle. Then she sends Vasilisa out into the dark to fetch a light from the only house nearby that might have one. On the road, Vasilisa passes three riders, one in white on a white horse, one in red, one in black. Each overtakes her and vanishes. She reaches the hut, the bone fence, the burning skull eyes, and Baba Yaga arrives home flying in her mortar, sniffs the air, and takes the girl in. On terms. Vasilisa may have her fire, but first, she will work for it, and if the work isn't done, she'll be eaten. The tasks are absurd, sort of vast mixed heap of grain by morning, clean the whole hut, cook a meal for one from provisions meant for 10. Vasilisa feeds her doll each night, and each morning it is done, and she does not ask how. She does notice, though, that disembodied hands appear from nowhere to do Baba Yaga's own work, and that the three riders, white, red, black, pass by again while she watches. Eventually, Baba Yaga invites her to ask a question, any question. Vasilisa asks about the riders. They are hers, Baba Yaga says. Her bright day, her red sun, her dark night. Vasilisa opens her mouth to ask about the hands, and stops herself. Asked why, she says only that some things are better left unknown, that too much knowledge ages a person before their time. That is the right answer. Baba Yaga tells her so directly that she eats the ones who are too curious, and that if Vasilisa had asked about anything inside the hut, rather than what merely passes by outside it, she would already be in the oven. Then Baba Yaga asks her own question back. How has Vasilisa managed all this work? And Vasilisa, without thinking, answers honestly, by my mother's blessing. Wrong answer. Baba Yaga throws her out on the spot. I want no blessed ones under my roof. But she keeps her bargain regardless. She takes a skull from the fence, its eyes still burning, sets it on a stick, and hands it to the girl as her fire. Walking home, frightened of the thing she's carrying, Vasilisa tries more than once to throw it away. The skull speaks and tells her not to. She carries it home, and when she sets it down in her stepmother's house, a household that has, mysteriously, been unable to keep a single flame lit for the 3 days she was gone, the skull's burning gaze follows the stepmother and her daughters through the dark, and by morning there is nothing left of them but ash. Vasilisa buries the skull in the earth and walks away. Notice what the tale is actually rewarding, because it isn't what a modern ear expects. It punishes curiosity and rewards restraint. Vasilisa survives specifically by not asking, and it treats being blessed, being good in the ordinary sense, as a disqualification rather than a virtue. It's the one honest answer that gets her thrown out of the house. Baba Yaga's hut is not a place where the categories of the ordinary Christian world apply. It runs on a different ledger entirely, and the tale never explains what that ledger is. It just shows you how to survive being read by it. And notice, too, what Baba Yaga does and doesn't do here. She threatens death. She sets a trap dressed as chores. And when the terms are met, she pays in full, exactly as promised, down to walking a murderous, self-lighting skull out through her own gate. She is not the villain of this story. The stepmother is. Baba Yaga is something else. A toll, honestly priced, at the edge of the world. Here is a fact that tends to surprise people once they sit with it. The first time Baba Yaga is written down anywhere, in any surviving document, is the year 1755. Not the Middle Ages, not some monk's marginal note in a medieval chronicle. 1755, which is later than Bach, later than Newton's Principia. The same decade Samuel Johnson was compiling his Dictionary of English, and the document she appears in isn't a folktale collection or a piece of literature at all. It's a grammar book, Mikhail Lomonosov's Russian grammar, where her name turns up twice, once in a list of Slavic gods and spirits, set, notably, against their nearest Roman equivalent, Jupiter for Perun and so on. Except Baba Yaga is given no Roman equivalent at all. Whatever Lomonosov thought she was, he thought she didn't map onto anything Rome had. That's the whole paper trail before the 1800s. One name, in one list, in one grammar. She may be far older than that. Almost everyone who studies her assumes she is. But there is no document that says so, and it's worth being honest about the size of that gap. Nearly everything we actually know of her comes from one man working 100 years later. Alexander Afanasyev was born in 1826 and died at 45 of tuberculosis, having spent much of his short career in some degree of trouble with the Russian censors. Between 1855 and 1867, he published 8 volumes of Russian folk tales, close to 600 stories, drawn not mostly from his own fieldwork, but compiled from existing archives. Folktale collections held by the Russian Geographical Society, roughly 150 tales given to him by the lexicographer Vladimir Dal. A smaller set he gathered himself near Voronezh. By the standards of his era, his method was unusually careful. He printed multiple variants of the same story side by side, rather than smoothing them into one official version, the way the Brothers Grimm tended to. That habit is the only reason we can see, today, how genuinely inconsistent Baba Yaga is across the tradition. Afanasyev preserved the mess instead of editing it away, and the mess turns out to be the most honest part of the record. He also had a theory about what he was collecting, and the theory hasn't aged well. In a separate 3-volume work, he argued that Russian folktales were the surviving fragments of an old Slavic nature religion, sun gods and storm gods worn down into fairy tale characters. That was the fashionable scholarship of his generation. It is not accepted today. So when a claim about Baba Yaga traces back to Afanasyev's own interpretation, rather than to the tales he collected, it needs to be held a little more loosely. The name itself is two puzzles stacked on top of each other. Baba is the easier half. Across Serbian, Croatian, Bulgarian, and Romanian, it simply means grandmother or old woman, plain and respectful. But in Russian and Polish, it doubles as something less kind, a dismissive word for a woman, specifically an old, foolish, or dirty one. Both meanings are alive in the tales at once. Characters address her respectfully, as babushka, precisely when they're trying hard not to be eaten. Yaga is where the puzzle stops being solvable. There is, at this point, no scholarly consensus on what it means or where it comes from. And I want to be plain about that, rather than picking the tidiest sounding theory and presenting it as settled. Afanasiev himself linked it to a Sanskrit word for serpent. That idea belongs to the 19th century, and nobody maintains it now. The standard reference position from the etymologist Max Vasmer reconstructs an old Slavic root meaning something like illness or horror or wrath. And even that gloss shifts depending on which summary of Vasmer you read. What's genuinely solid is a family of related words across the Slavic languages. A Serbian and Croatian word for horror or a shudder, a Slovene word for anger, an old Czech word for a legendary evil female being, a modern Czech word for a wicked wood nymph, a Polish word that simply means witch or fury. The family is real. What it doesn't do is tell us which of those meanings came first, or whether the root began as an emotion, an illness, or a creature. 5 plausible answers. No way to choose between them. That isn't scholars being lazy. It's what happens when a word surfaces in writing 3 centuries after. By every reasonable guess, it was already old. She isn't only Russian either. The name shifts as it crosses borders, but the figure keeps recurring. Ukrainian and Belarusian tellings use nearly the same name. Polish folklore has Jenza, a witch of the same temperament. Czech and Slovak tradition has Jezubaba. Serbian and Croatian children are frightened with Baba Roga. Bulgarian and Romanian folklore keep a figure with the same job. Forest, threat, testing hospitality, under an entirely different name, the Forest Mother. Scholars generally infer that these all descend from one common figure, sometime in or before the Middle Ages. But notice the shape of that sentence. Or before is carrying all the weight, and nobody can point to the document that would let it carry less. Start with something that is simply true and documented, and not a theory at all. Across the forests of northern Eurasia, people really did build small houses that stand on legs. Hunting peoples and reindeer herders across Siberia, Evenki communities, and Uralic peoples such as the Mansi, among others, built raised log stores, windowless, doorless on the ground level, lifted clear of the earth on posts or on the stumps of trees cut at around head height. Russian ethnography has a name for this structure, a labaz. The purpose was entirely practical. Lifted off the ground, meat and supplies stay out of reach of bears and wolverines and rodents during long absences, and the cold air moving underneath does the rest of the work a refrigerator would do. You climbed up to it, often through a trapdoor in the floor, rather than walking in through a door, and where the structure was raised on the stumps of 2 or 3 closely grown trees. The spreading, exposed roots beneath it would, from any distance, in poor light, look very much like legs. That's one real building. Here is a second. Several Siberian peoples, the Evenki again, and the Saka, sometimes called the yakut, practiced a form of burial above the ground rather than in it. A raised platform, called an aranga, on which the dead were placed rather than interred. A shaman especially, sometimes with his horse. In a country where the ground is frozen solid for most of the year and gives nothing back to a shovel, putting the dead up instead of down is not exotic. It is simply the sensible option. So in the same forest, built by the same hands, out of the same timber, there stood two structures that would look, from a distance, like the same thing. A small house on legs that holds food, and a small house on legs that holds a body. The Russian folklorist Alexandra Barkova has connected Baba Yaga's chicken-legged hut specifically to above-ground burial practice among the Moksha, a Finno-Ugric people. The hut, in this reading, as a house built to hold the dead on the border between two worlds, so that they could still be honored, still be visited, without quite being let back in. That's the material half of the answer, and it's solid ground. What comes next is not material at all. It's an argument, a good one, made by one particular scholar, and it deserves to be labeled as exactly that. Vladimir Prop was a Russian formalist folklorist working in Leningrad in the first half of the 20th century. In 1928, he published a study called Morphology of the Folktale, in which he did something nobody had done properly before. He took a large body of Russian wonder tales, almost entirely Afanasyev's collection, and showed that underneath their surface variety, they're built from a small, fixed set of narrative moves, occurring again and again in the same order. Baba Yaga, in his scheme, is the textbook example of what he called the donor, the figure who tests the hero, and, if the test is passed, hands over the thing he needs to continue. 18 years later, in a second book called The Historical Roots of the Wonder Tale, Prop went further and asked where that pattern might have come from. His answer, that the wonder tale, as a form, is the worn-down residue of ancient initiation rites and of old beliefs about a journey into the land of the dead. And when he turned that lens on Baba Yaga specifically, the pieces started fitting together in a way that's genuinely elegant, whether or not you end up believing it. The hut, on this reading, isn't a house in the woods. It's the threshold, the actual border between the living and the dead, and its shape remembers the raised grave house it's descended from. That's why it has no door on the living side, and has to be turned. The threshold faces one direction at a time. That's why Baba Yaga is blind, and has to smell you rather than see you, because in Prop's reading, the dead cannot see the living at all. And that line she says, about the Russian spirit, the smell of you offending her, is, on this account, the mirror image of the way the living have always described the smell of the dead. It's the story telling you, in one sentence, exactly what threshold you've just crossed. Even the hospitality fits. Baba Yaga washes her guests, feeds them, before any business is discussed. And in Prop's reading, that isn't manners, it's ritual. The food she offers is understood, in the old logic he's reconstructing, as the food of the dead. Eating it is what admits a living visitor to the other side, which is why, in some versions of these tales, the hero insists on being fed and bathed before he'll answer a single question. He is choosing, on purpose, to complete the rite that lets him pass. And the oven, the one detail everybody remembers, the threat of being cooked and eaten, becomes, in this frame, not a cooking pot, but a kind of forge. the mechanism of a symbolic death and a symbolic return, the shape underneath every coming of age. Now the part that has to be said clearly, because it's the whole point of laying it out this way. The buildings are fact. Labaz and Aranga are ethnographic record, photographed, catalogued, still built in living memory in some places. Slavic and Finno-Ugric and Tungusic peoples were in sustained contact across the Russian north for well over 1,000 years. Trading, migrating, settling near one another, and images travel exactly the way people do. All of that is solid. The leap from the buildings to the story is not fact. It's inference, a good one, made independently by more than one careful scholar, but an inference all the same. Nobody in the 1850s told Afanasyev's collectors, in so many words, this hut is a grave house. That connection is a 20th century reconstruction, built entirely out of tales that were written down 100 years after the fact about a prehistory nobody alive had witnessed. Prop's initiation theory in particular is now regarded, even by scholars who respect it, as suggestive rather than proven. A beautiful reading, not a discovered fact, which leaves the honest version of the chapter sitting exactly where it should. The house on legs was almost certainly a real thing, remembered. What it actually meant to the first people who told a story about it is something we can propose and argue for, and never quite recover. Prop, the same scholar who built the most systematic theory anyone has ever built around this figure, made an observation about her that is worth sitting with before anything else. The various depictions of Baba Yaga across the different tales, he wrote, do not add up to one coherent character. He wasn't being dismissive. He'd read more of the source material than almost anyone, and that was his honest conclusion. And once you go looking, the inconsistencies are everywhere, and they don't resolve. Start with something as basic as how many of her there are. In most tales, one. But in a story called The Maiden Tsar, also from Afanasyev's collection, the hero Ivan travels to not one hut, but 3, in sequence. And in each one, there is a Baba Yaga, 3 sisters, all bearing the exact same name, each with slightly more to tell him than the last. One collection, one tradition, both a singular figure and a set of 3, without any sense that this is a contradiction worth explaining, or her disposition. Donor in one story, generous, exacting, fair, child-eating ogress in the next, armed antagonist in a third, sword in hand rather than oven door open. These aren't moods of one consistent character. They're incompatible roles that happen to share a name, or simply what she looks like. Bone-legged, iron-toothed, blind, enormous, sprawled across her own stove, with her nose grown into the ceiling. In other tellings, tall and gaunt. These descriptions don't compose into a single body you could picture, because nobody was ever describing one. The scholar, Andreas Johns, whose book-length study of Baba Yaga is the standard modern treatment in English, makes the case that this isn't a puzzle to be solved by digging for some original, coherent version underneath the mess. His argument is that the ambiguity may not be a corruption of anything. She may, he suggests, always have been this unsettled, and the search for one true underlying Baba Yaga has been the wrong question from the start. So if there's no single figure to trace back, there are at least 4 competing stories about where she comes from, and none of them has won. The oldest is the one Afanasiev himself believed, that she's a decayed nature spirit, a piece of old Slavic weather and forest religion, worn down over centuries into a fairy tale character. That framework, reading every old folktale figure as a faded god, was the fashionable scholarship of the 1860s across several countries at once, and it has been almost entirely abandoned by later researchers. It survives mostly in writing that hasn't caught up with that. A second, more specific claim, that she's a genuine surviving goddess of death and regeneration, going back to prehistoric Europe. This claim comes with real academic weight behind it. It was written by the archaeologist Maria Gimbutas in the Encyclopedia of Religion in 1987, and it states, as settled fact, that Baba Yaga descends from prehistoric vulture and owl goddesses, and pairs her with a male death figure as a kind of divine couple. Here's where the chapter has to slow down, because this is exactly the kind of thing worth being careful about on air. Gimbutas built her career on a larger theory, that a peaceful, goddess-centered civilization once spanned prehistoric Europe before being overrun by a more warlike, patriarchal culture arriving from the steppe. It's a compelling story. It is also not accepted by mainstream archaeology. Other serious archaeologists, Lynn Meskel and Ruth Tringham among the most direct critics, have argued that Gimbutas read essentially all of the evidence as proof of goddess worship, whether or not it actually supported that she downplayed the male imagery sitting right alongside the female imagery she emphasized, and that even where a female deity clearly was worshipped, the ethnographic record shows women in such societies didn't necessarily hold high status as a result. Tringham's sharpest point was simply that the evidence from this period is far too thin and ambiguous to support the kind of confident, specific claims Gimbutas routinely made. So the single most authoritative-looking source on Baba Yaga, an entry in a respected reference encyclopedia written by a credentialed archaeologist, turns out to be built on a framework her own colleagues rejected. That isn't a case for throwing Gimbutas out entirely. Her other work, on the movement of steppe peoples into Europe, is still taken seriously. It's a reminder that a citation looking impressive and a citation being reliable are two different tests, and it's worth applying both. A third theory, close cousin of the second, that she began as a totemic ancestress, a symbol of some earlier matriarchal stage of human society, later demoted and made frightening once that stage gave way to a more patriarchal one. This rests on a 19th century anthropological idea that human societies everywhere pass through an early matriarchal phase, which later anthropology has on the whole set aside for lack of evidence. And Johns's finding about her ambiguity undercuts this reading at the root anyway. A story about a goddess demoted into a monster only works if there was ever one clear, stable thing to demote her from. The record doesn't show that. And a fourth, much more modest theory, which doesn't require any lost prehistoric religion at all, that she's simply a bogey, a figure invented or adopted to keep children out of a forest that was genuinely dangerous. This one has real, documented backing. Her Serbian cousin, Baba Roga, is explicitly used to frighten children even now, and the Bulgarian and Romanian folklore has parallel forest mother figures doing precisely that job. But documented recent use isn't the same as documented origin. That she was used this way in 1850 tells us nothing certain about what she was in 1250, and a figure who started out as something else entirely could have been recruited into frightening children at any point along the way. There's a smaller, stranger example of the same problem worth mentioning, because it shows how deep the disagreement goes. There's a famous 18th century Russian popular print, a lubok, showing Baba Yaga in combat with a crocodile. Dmitry Ravinsky, the great 19th century cataloguer of these prints, read it as political satire, a coded jab at a specific ruler. Other researchers, looking at the very same image, have read it as evidence of a shamanic dimension to her character, entirely missed by the political reading. Same print, two serious, irreconcilable interpretations. Nobody has settled it, and there's no obvious way anybody could. Here, finally, is why none of this resolves. And it isn't really about Baba Yaga specifically. It's about what oral tradition is. There is no text naming her before 1755. Not a fragment, not a chronicle mention, not even a church sermon condemning the practice, the kind of thing that does exist for some other folk figures centuries earlier. The tales themselves were written down in the 1850s and 60s by collectors who already had theories about what they were collecting and who had, in most cases, read the Brothers Grimm. An oral tradition simply doesn't preserve a timeline the way written texts or buried artifacts do. An archaeologist can date a layer of soil. Nobody can date a detail inside a story first recorded in 1860. It might be 1,000 years old, or it might have been added by the storyteller's own grandmother the winter before. Which means every confident claim about the original Baba Yaga, goddess, ancestress, spirit, bogey, is a reconstruction, running backwards from 19th century paper into a past nobody documented as it happened. Not worthless. Several of these ideas are genuinely careful, genuinely argued, but not evidence either. What we actually have is a figure who steps into the written record already fully formed in a grammar book in 1755, with no equivalent offered in any other tradition. And behind that single sentence, nothing but the forest. Baba Yaga isn't alone. Almost every neighboring folklore has something standing near her. Sometimes so near that it's the same story, moved into a different language, and sometimes only close enough to throw her into sharper relief by not matching at all. Start with the one that's genuinely the same story. In Germany, the Brothers Grimm recorded a tale called Frau Holle. A girl pricks her finger spinning by a well and drops her spindle in. Her stepmother sends her down after it, and she falls through into another world entirely. On the way, she passes a loaf of bread in an oven, begging to be taken out before it burns, and an apple tree, begging to be shaken free of its fruit. She helps both. She reaches the house of an old woman, Frau Holle, alarming to look at, and is set to work shaking out feather beds until the feathers fly, which, the tale explains, is what makes it snow up on the earth above. She works hard, is homesick, is sent home through a gate that showers her in gold on the way out. That is, structurally, the identical story to Vasilisa's. Not similar, identical, in the way folklorists actually classify tales. A girl is sent by a stepmother across a boundary into another world. An old woman there sets domestic tasks, and the reward is measured out in exact proportion to how well those tasks were done. And in both versions, the old woman isn't the villain of the piece. She's the mechanism the villain's cruelty runs into. What's different is almost more interesting than what's the same. Frau Holler doesn't eat anyone. There's no oven waiting for a wrong answer, no bone fence, no flying mortar. Her other world is reached by falling down a well, not by walking into a forest. And her moral arithmetic is legible in a way Baba Yaga's isn't. She rewards plain hard work, straightforwardly. Baba Yaga rewards something much stranger, knowing exactly when to stop asking questions. And there's a smaller pattern worth naming out loud, because it repeats. Jacob Grimm, in his own 19th century writing on German mythology, argued that Frau Holler was the surviving trace of a benevolent pre-Christian goddess. Later scholars, examining the actual medieval evidence, have found her earliest documented associations point toward the Virgin Mary, not toward any pagan figure at all. A striking old woman in a story, a 19th century folklorist reading her as a buried goddess, and modern research finding the chain of evidence doesn't hold. That is the exact shape of the Gimbutas problem from the last chapter, playing out a country away and a century earlier. Two traditions, walking into the same trap independently. The Alpine regions, Austria especially, Bavaria, South Tyrol, have a figure named Perchta, and she makes for a useful, deliberate contrast because she takes Baba Yaga's job and does it completely differently. Perchta appears in two forms in the tradition, beautiful and ugly, and it's the ugly one that matters here. A small, wrinkled old woman with a long, hooked nose and one strange, deformed foot, a goose foot in most descriptions. She is the enforcer of a very specific household duty, spinning. Anyone whose wool or flax wasn't finished by the appointed night faced her punishment, which the older accounts describe with genuine violence. The belly slit open and stuffed with straw. She moves during the 12 nights between Christmas and Epiphany. And even today, in parts of Austria, masked processions called the Perchtenlauf walk through villages on those nights carrying torches, wearing enormous carved horned masks. She is attested far earlier than Baba Yaga, and this is worth pausing on. A theologian named Thomas Ebbendorfer condemned offerings left out for Frau Percht by name in writing around the year 1439, 3 centuries before Lomonosov's grammar book. A tradition often assumed to be the younger of the two turns out to have the older paper trail. She resembles Baba Yaga in the obvious ways, an old woman, physically strange, who punishes for conduct rather than for any real wrongdoing, in a domain that's specifically domestic and female. But she's fixed to a date on the calendar rather than to a place in the forest. You don't travel to Perchta. She arrives on the night, whether you sought her out or not. There's no threshold to cross, no journey, and critically, no donor role. She never once hands a hero the thing he needs to finish his quest. She audits, Baba Yaga equips. Closer to home, linguistically, are two figures that aren't really separate characters at all, so much as the same word wearing different national dress. Polish folklore has Jędza, a name, and, at the same time, an ordinary word for a witch or a fury. Czech and Slovak tradition has Jezubaba, described by scholars as closely related to Baba Yaga, both very likely descending from one common figure, sometime in or before the Middle Ages. She's best known outside Czech-speaking countries through Dvořák's opera Rusalka, where she's the witch who grants the water nymph human legs. On conditions, a bargain that ultimately destroys the person who accepts it. A donor, exactly like Baba Yaga, whose gift comes at a genuine cost, What's odd is where this shared name simply stops. It's confined, more or less exactly, to the East Slavic lands, plus Slovakia and the Czech lands, and nobody in the scholarship has a settled explanation for why the name form doesn't spread further than that, into Polish or South Slavic territory it would otherwise seem to border naturally. It's a small, honest, loose thread, and it's worth leaving it as one rather than tying it off with a guess. For real contrast, there's a figure who inverts Baba Yaga in almost every coordinate at once. Lady Midday, known across Polish, Czech, Russian, Serbian, and Bulgarian tradition, under local names that all mean roughly the same thing. She appears not at night, but at noon, the hottest hour of the harvest, in the open field rather than the deep forest. Usually a young woman in white, though sometimes an old woman, sometimes a young girl, sometimes nothing more than a spinning column of dust. She confronts field workers with difficult riddles, and those who fail are said to be struck down, driven mad, or simply overcome by the heat. She keeps children out of the standing crop, and keeps adults from working straight through the deadliest part of the day, which is to say, she is, quite transparently, a piece of practical safety folklore wearing a supernatural face. Here's why she belongs in this chapter. She has the riddle, the test, the female form, the real danger, and absolutely no donor role whatsoever. There's no correct etiquette that earns you a magic horse from Lady Midday. She's a hazard with a face, nothing more, nothing less, which proves something about Baba Yaga that's easy to take for granted. Her ambivalence, threat, and gift giver in one figure isn't just what Slavic folklore automatically does with a frightening old woman. This same tradition produced Lady Midday, plainly and simply malevolent whenever it wanted to. Baba Yaga is doing something else on purpose, and the fact that the alternative exists right next to her is the proof. One more from further north, useful precisely because the source itself needs a warning label. Luhi is the powerful mistress of Pojola, the far northern realm in the Kalevala, the great collection of Finnish and Karelian oral poetry assembled in the 1830s by a physician and folklorist named Elias Lönnrot. It matters that assembled is the right word. Lönnrot didn't transcribe a single continuous poem. He selected fragments of older oral verse and stitched them into one epic for a national project of his own. And in doing so, he appears to have split one older figure into two separate characters. So everything Luhi tells us about older Finnic belief comes filtered through one 19th century editor with an agenda, the same caution that applies to Afanasieff, only sharper. Inside that text, she's formidable. Mistress of a cold northern country bordering the land of the dead, a sorceress who can change her shape at will, and a setter of impossible tasks. It's the trials she assigns to her daughter's suitors that lead, eventually, to the forging of the Sampo, a mysterious mill said to grind out endless wealth. She is not simply an enemy. In one episode, she rescues the hero Venemoinen after he washes ashore, exhausted, and gives him shelter before their conflict resumes. A formidable old woman ruling a cold otherworld, a task setter whose trials drive the entire plot forward, genuinely ambivalent rather than simply evil. The resemblance to Baba Yaga is real. So is the difference. Luhi has a household, daughters, property, a continuous story. Baba Yaga is a solitary encounter in a clearing, with nothing before it and nothing after. What's worth saying, honestly, before closing this out, the strongest evidence in this whole episode is architectural, not personal. Raised grave houses, real, photographed, built by real hands across the Siberian taiga. That holds up. A matching character, a named guardian who lives at such a hut and tests the people who come to it in the actual Venki or Mansi or Saka traditions themselves, that does not clearly exist. The parallel is a shape in the landscape, not a shared character across cultures. If a source ever hands you a tidy, ready-made Siberian twin for Baba Yaga, that tidiness is the thing to be suspicious of. She sits, in the end, exactly where the forest sits in all these traditions, at the edge of what's known, guarding a threshold that has to be crossed on foot, one traveller at a time, on terms she alone sets and always, strangely, honours. Sleep well.